everyone, Kristina Werner here. I'm back with another video for SimonsTheStamp.com, and today I'm going to be using the Sketch Ranunculus stamp set from Simon. I'm prepping some watercolor paper with an anti-static powder tool. This will help me as I do some heat embossing. And the watercolor paper I'm using today is from Strathmore. It is cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 tall. I'm going to take each image from the stamp set individually, and I'm going to stamp them one at a time in Versamark ink and then apply some embossing powder on top. The color of embossing powder that I'm using is Rich Pale Gold from WOW. It's my most favorite gold embossing powder and I really love it. I'm going to continue on with stamping each of the images and then putting embossing powder on it right away. I have not heat set them in between all of the steps. I'm not planning to overlap the stamps at all, so it's okay to do that. If you were going to be overlapping the stamps a little bit or doing some masking, you might want to heat emboss each one after you've applied the embossing powder. So after I had the entire area stamped and all of the embossing powder applied, I took my heat tool and very meticulously and carefully went over each area that I've stamped and melted that embossing powder. You want to make sure that as you tip the piece in the light that you don't see any powder granules. Once you don't see any of that powder and it's all nice and smooth, you know that everything's been melted. Taken my watercolor paper and adhered it to a hard board with some blue painter's tape. This is going to hold it in place while I do some watercoloring. The watercolor that I'm using today is Peerless Watercolor, and I'm only using 4 different sheets. All of these colors are available in the bonus pack. These are some small sheets of Peerless Watercolor and they last a really long time. The color that is on the sheets is very concentrated. I'm only going to need a very small amount to get lots of color, and you'll see that once I get painting here. I'm using a small aquash brush from Pentel, and I'm just picking up a little bit of that color and then bringing it over to my project here. And you can see how concentrated that color is, and it's just from that little tiny corner of the Peerless watercolor sheet that I've touched with my wet brush. So these watercolor sheets last a really long time. I've actually punched out some squares out of most of my sheets, or all of them, and created a swatch book that I can use. But in this case, I was only using 4 colors, so I decided to just go straight from the sheets. And it also makes it so that if I need to add more and more color, that I don't have any problems with that. So that first color I used was Peacock Blue, and this yellow is called Gamboge Yellow. The kind of pinkish red is called Tea Rose Pink, and then I'll eventually be adding a green color, and that green color is called Olive Green. So the thing that's really fun about watercoloring over the top of embossing is that heated embossing powder that has melted, it creates a nice smooth surface and it resists any moisture that's put on top. So you could do this with watercolors or with inks or different paints. Anything that has moisture to it, it will be resisted, and you don't have to worry about any of the fussy painting and getting into little individual detailed areas. You can do a nice wash over each area and the embossing powder will resist it, and the original embossing lines will show through. It's kind of a really fun way to do some watercoloring. So I'm adding in some green leaves, and as soon as I've got all those green leaves on there, I'm going to go ahead and dry the entire piece and then bring in some water droplets. I just sprayed some water into the palm of my hand and then flicked that onto the piece and also just let it drop. And once that water is sitting there for a minute, I use my paper towel to dab that up, and that brings up a little bit of that color. It reactivates the pigment underneath, and you can pull up that color. Adding a little bit of the blue to an acrylic block and flicking that off the edge of the acrylic block, that gives me some nice droplets. I'm also doing that with the Tea Rose Pink. So after all that was done, I went ahead and dried my watercolor piece, and now I'm going to do some lettering on top. Instead of using a stamp, I thought I would use the Finetec Gold palette and use a brush, the same water brush that I've been using for the rest of the painting, and paint on that gold into the word hello. So I'm using my Finetec Gold palette like I mentioned before. I'm using the gold color that is the 3rd from the bottom, or I guess the 4th in this set, depending on which way you're looking at it. So I just added a little bit of water from my water brush onto that gold color, and now I'm going to draw on the word hello. So if you're going to be doing brush lettering, the thing you have to remember is that the areas that are thickened are the ones that are the downstroke. So you can see I'm adding a thicker line right there. That's because my hand is naturally pulling towards my body. It's a downstroke, and those are the strokes that will have the thickest lines. So I'm doing this in a really slow fashion. I've sped up the video here, but I did it rather slowly. And I think as long as you do it pretty slowly, I think even if you are inexperienced with brush lettering, you can get a pretty good effect with this. If you don't want to do all of the lettering like this, you could actually draw it all in one line and then go back in and add the thicker lines, kind of like what I did on the beginning of the letter H. The Finetec Gold watercolor didn't match perfectly with my heat embossing, so in order to get those gold colors to mix a little bit more, I thought I would add some gold droplets as well. So I'm putting that gold Finetec watercolor on the edge of an acrylic block, and like I did with the blue and the red Peerless watercolors, I'm flicking it off the edge with my brush. That's going to add some nice gold little flicks onto my watercolor piece. Using some Nina Solar White cardstock, this is the 110-pound version for my card base. Scored that at 5.5 to create a top folding card, and then adhered my watercolor panel using some foam adhesive. So here's my card for today. Hope you guys enjoyed. This is actually a really fun method to use some of those outline stamps you might have in your stash. By embossing the whole area and then watercoloring over top, it's a little bit more forgiving, and it's a fun way to get a nice watercolor effect. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video here at simonsystamp.com.